So I just wanted to do a short video on like a filter I use that has proven to be kind of pretty precise as a guide when you're reading old sources of Nordic Iron Age and Viking Age, and especially if you're looking at the power dynamics. And now I'm talking pre the Kalmar Union and the unification of the Norwegian and Danish and Swedish throne, which changed all these dynamics completely. So, and especially for Norway during the unification period under Harald, and up until Queen Margaret I. There's this filter which is the dialects of Norway, and of course this isn't a clean cut or anything like dead set, but it's kind of like if you use a strong, in financial analysis, you have strong signals that tell you about movements in the markets and stuff, and that have been consistent throughout a long time. This would be one of those signals that, doesn't give you the whole picture, but it's a clear indicator of power dynamics in Norway in that period. And that's the dialects. So Norway has very wildly changing dialects, and it's known for it in Scandinavia, that you compared to, for example, the Danish dialects, which are more similar. In Norway you have big variations in the dialects. And if you look at how they trace out in the geography, and it makes sense. And look at the power dynamics of Norway before it was placed under the Danish throne. These dialects more or less line up with like the main fault lines of Norwegian power dynamics. So, for example, the RP, like most proper Norwegian, which we call bokmål dialects, are centered around Vik, what's today Oslo, and this area, and they are also the most similar to Danish in having the same, ikke and ikke in Norwegian, ikke in Danish, having it's very close to Danish grammatically, even the dialect, and of course the pronunciation is different, but super close to Denmark. And these are also the areas in Vik that, going back to Iron Ages and before in the archaeological record, way into the Bronze Age, these have strong connections with Jutland and also Zealand, Danish areas. Then if you go to the fjords on the west, you'll hear in the dialect similarities to how to the tone of Icelandic, for example, and of course from what was before called Sognefjordane, this area, well, in Sognefjord and Bergen area, all this area, that was the area predominantly that left for Iceland and colonized Iceland. And if you listen to Faroese, you can hear similarities with the northwestern fjord dialects. I'm not saying this is like super close, but you can, as a Norwegian, you can hear these connections, and probably the other way around as well. A very, very clear dialect and power structure fault line is along the largest lake in Norway. It's Lake Miosa. Now, if you're on the Swedish facing side, And along the coast of Lake Miosa, on the other side as well, the dialect in these areas is very different from the Oslo dialect, and completely different from the Western dialect, and also from the neighboring Valdres dialect. And it has very many Swedish commonalities with Swedish and Old Gutnish, and it's the placement of this area of a dialect is completely consistent with the exodus during the Iron Age from the area of Lake Vänern, when, as described in Heimskringla, you have the Ynglingas come up out of Vänern after a famine, and they settle in these areas of southeastern Norway, kick out the chieftains who are there, and take it as their own. And their main seats were at Ringsaker, and they had strong ties to Toten, and of course in Österdalen and down in Alvdal. So, and all these areas on the east going towards Sweden have strong connections to Swedish. And you can also see along the place names on along Lake Miosa, Svea in many place names, and Sve, the prefix or suffix of Sve is the prefix is very common there, and you don't really see that so much elsewhere in Norway. And that's Svea was of course the old name for Swedish, Svene. Where does this Swedish dialect end? So basically, when you're on that side of Lake Miosa, the mountains, you kind of start the mountains towards what is today called Jotunheimen, the hill areas that lead up to that start. And once you cross those mountains, you come into Etnedal and Gausdal, and into Valdres, and through Torpa, and the dialect flips. And you have the similar words as in West Norse, like ikke, eg, and while the Swedish, kind of Swedish, Toten and Hedmark's dialect has itte, like in Swedish inte. And the same thing, and the choke point for this dialect is a place called Höljarast, between Etnedal and Valdres, and going into what is called Nordreland, which is northern lands, just south. And there's a tiny choke point from like a flat river valley south of Etnedal. It chokes into a crevice almost, where a river, Etna River, passes through and then opens up into Etnedal and Valdres. And that's kind of like the traditional dividing point from Valdres to the south, and also for the dialect. Of course, there's some bleed going south into Nordreland with Dokka, that people there still speak of Valdres. There's some, overlap there, but that is more or less like the dialect border. And the same going up from Mjøsa. When you go further east, you have a choke point south in Gudbrandsdalen, where the dialects start changing when you come up into Gausdal and further up into Gudbrandsdalen. And they change radically from the Toten, Biri and Hedmark's dialect. So, and these power dynamics line exactly up with, if you're reading, for example, the one saga I'm currently in now, Harald Hårfagre's saga, Harald Fairhair's saga. These points are exactly, he has to ally, his power base is in the old Swedish colored dialect area, going down to Vik, and he has to ally with the kings of Uppland in order, to consolidate Norway. And he has to ally with the kings of Møre in order to have a sufficient power base to push into the fjord kings that he isn't, the southern fjord kings that he isn't allied with. He does have some allies in Sognefjord, but and Harald Hårfagre's family, of course, comes from ultimately from Sweden, but up through Hedmark and Ringsaker. And if you remember, his father, Halfdan the Black, was attacked from, had his farm and power base on the east side of Lake Miosa, and was famously, attacked from probably the area of Kapp Lena on the other side of Miosa. So I just think it's interesting, especially for Norwegians, of course, but also to know from the outside how these dialects line up with the power dynamics. And you can read it also in like the legendary sagas, even going all the way back. This curious thing that if you have some local knowledge, you'll see immediately what they're talking about. Where in Sögebrøt, where they're talking about the Battle of Bråvellir, this massive battle in the Iron Age between the Danish and the Swedish kings, where you have also Norwegian petty kings joining in for the action. And it mentions that everybody on the side with the Norwegians kind of didn't want to be close to the Telemark contingent, because they have had such a backwards and weird dialect. And that's still kind of like a joke among Norwegian dialects, that the Telemark Setesdal dialect is like particularly a particularly difficult dialect to understand and backwards. And this saga is tracing stories back to 700 AD. Particularly, personally, I find that dialect beautiful, but it's kind of like a long-standing thing in Norwegian culture, that the Telemark dialect is especially difficult to get to grasps with. Of course, those warriors, they made a very well accounting for themselves in that battle. So I'm not saying this is dead set, and of course it's not something to be taken as a fact. It's just an interesting filter, and especially if you're from Norway, and you weren't aware of this, it's an interesting way, when you read the sagas or read older history of the North, that you can quickly see outlines of the power dynamics of the time. One data point. And of course you can criticize it and say, no, these developments are much faster and from a later period. And that might be. For me, especially the fault line of the Hedmark's dialect and Toten dialect seems like a super clear indicator of Swedish migration into southeastern Norway, and the period that fits it is there 400-500 AD, and it fits all the geographical areas. So that was just I think is an interesting data point when trying to quickly filter out and see power dynamics of Scandinavia, and particularly the petty kingdoms of Norway and the Viking and Iron Age.